All right, everybody. Welcome to Mr. Williamson's review of creating energy. As we all know, hopefully by now, when I say ATP, you say energy, because that is the molecule that we use to create energy. Now, there's a couple ways in which energy is created. The plants are going to use a process called photosynthesis, and animals are going to use a process called cellular respiration. Plants actually use cellular respiration as well, but for simplicity's sake, we'll just go ahead and say plants are using photosynthesis. So I wanted to start off by giving you guys some context. So if you remember that day we went out under the tree, we learned and we talked about how humans release carbon dioxide when they breathe out. And we are all pretty familiar with that. We know that carbon dioxide we breathe that out. And the other thing that we're familiar with is that oxygen, O2, is released by plants. We've known since like third grade that plants give us the oxygen that we need. A couple things that you may not be familiar with is that plants are going to produce glucose, and that is going to be the molecule that we need the most to create that energy, and that is we're going to break down in cellular respiration. So glucose is going to be vital to humans. And the other thing that you may not realize is that humans release water when we breathe out. So if you were in class on that day, I made everybody breathe on their cell phone, and you saw that fog show up on that screen of your phone. So we release H2O, water, and carbon dioxide, which plants need. And then plants in return give us oxygen and glucose. So let's dive in a little bit deeper. That's a little bit of a recap, sort of an overview. Let's talk about how plants produce glucose and oxygen from carbon dioxide and water. So they're going to use a process called photosynthesis. And this is a process that takes place in the chloroplast. So plants are going to use carbon dioxide and water to create glucose and oxygen. It's going to be done with a process called photosynthesis, and it's going to be in a chloroplast. Now, I drew a chloroplast here for you beautiful people. And the nice thing about photosynthesis is that there's only 2 steps. Cellular respiration has 3 steps. Photosynthesis has 2, so it makes it a little bit easier. A couple of things that I wanted to bring out about the chloroplast. The chloroplast is an organelle, and it has certain parts, just like a body has different body parts, arms, legs, head, that kind of thing. Chloroplasts have different parts. And the 2 main parts that I want you all to know about is the thylakoid, which is these sort of I like to call them poker chips. They're these sort of stacked discs. And chloroplasts have tons and tons and tons of stacks of these chloroplasts. I just drew one for simplicity's sake. And then the stroma is the liquid that surrounds the thylakoids. It's sort of like the cytoplasm of the cell. It's this sort of gel-like liquid stuff that's inside the chloroplast. And those are the 2 parts of the chloroplast. And likewise, there are 2 parts to photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis is the reaction that takes place inside the chloroplast, just like classroom would be like the chloroplast, and photosynthesis would be like learning. We learn inside the classroom. Photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast. So the first step of photosynthesis is the light-dependent reaction. Okay, the light-dependent reaction. And what's going to happen in the light-dependent reaction is we're going to take water, okay? Water is going to diffuse into the chloroplast and enter the thylakoid. And when water comes into the thylakoid, it's going to be split by the sunlight energy that comes from the sun. So water is going to be split, and it's going to turn into oxygen, which is going to be kicked out right here. Okay, so oxygen gets kicked out. Now, notice you can see that there's an oxygen here, and there's an oxygen here. So what's happening is we're splitting that hydrogen off of the oxygen, and the oxygens are combining to O2, and oxygen is going to get kicked out. The other thing that we produce in the light-dependent reaction is a molecule called ATP. Now, when I say ATP, hopefully you guys think energy. We're going to create ATP during the light-dependent reaction. Now, this is going to be important because the next step is going to use that. So That's the first step. That's the half of photosynthesis. So if you know that half, then you've got a 50% on this test coming up. Now we're going to move over here to step 2. All right, so step 2 is going to be called the light independent. They call it the light independent reaction because, you guessed it, we don't need sunlight anymore. We're going to use a different form of energy, which we created in the first step. So let me just sort of give you guys the lowdown of what happens. We're going to take carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is going to flow into the stroma, and this ATP is going to come over here. We're going to take 6 carbon dioxides. We're going to take the carbons off of the oxygens in CO2, and we're going to create 1 molecule of glucose. And the reason we only create 1 molecule of glucose is because 1 molecule of glucose has 6 carbons in it, so we're going to need 6 carbon dioxide molecules to do that. And the energy that we use to split carbon dioxide to form glucose is that ATP energy right there. So ATP is the energy used in the light independent reaction. That's why we're independent of light. We don't need that light anymore because we created that ATP, which is going to be the energy used to split carbon dioxide into glucose. So glucose is going to be the final product of photosynthesis. So just as a quick recap, up here, we used water first in the light-dependent reaction along with sunlight, and we created oxygen, which is released. And then in the second step, light-independent reaction, we're going to take carbon dioxide and we're going to turn it into glucose using that ATP energy. So now I want to jump into this side of the equation here. What is happening in the human that produces carbon dioxide and water? So same thing here. Now let's talk about what happens with that glucose and oxygen. So glucose is going to be used in a process called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is going to take place in the mitochondria. So cellular respiration is the process, and the place that the process takes place is the mitochondria. Now, I always get students who get confused about this, and they're like, oh, cellular respiration is where this takes place, but that's just not true. Okay, mitochondria is the place, it's the thing. Just like chloroplast had thylakoids and stroma, mitochondria are going to have parts of it as well. So you got like an outer membrane, an inner membrane, a matrix, and I'm not super worried about you knowing all that, but I do want you to know that mitochondria is the location in which cellular respiration takes place. That rhymed. Pretty cool. Now, cellular respiration is a little more difficult. This is a mitochondria. I drew you out of mitochondria. I want you guys to follow along with me here. The first step to cellular respiration is a thing called glycolysis. Glycolysis just literally means splitting glucose. Lysis means to split. Glyco means glucose. So we're going to take that glucose molecule that we created in photosynthesis. Look here, y'all. There's 6 carbons, right? We're going to take glucose and we're going to turn it into a molecule called pyruvate. Okay, and that's the first step of cellular respiration. That's it. By the way, when we do that, we're going to release 2 ATP. All right, now pyruvate has 3 carbons in it, as you can see here, and the goal of pyruvate is to get into the mitochondria. We want to get into the mitochondria so that we can produce the most energy, okay? And there's a bunch of things that go along with that, but know that the pyruvate wants to get into the mitochondria. The thing that you must remember is that oxygen must be present in order for that pyruvate to move into the mitochondria. This is super important. If oxygen is not available, that's when our bodies convert to lactic acid. You remember me making you do those wall sits? Well, that's your body converting to lactic acid, converting that pyruvate into lactic acid in the absence of oxygen. So if there is oxygen available, we move into the mitochondria, and we're going to do the second step, which is called the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. Krebs cycle takes pyruvate, there's 3 carbon rings right there, and we're going to create 2 things. Number 1, we're going to create CO2, which is then kicked out. Okay, we know that we breathe out carbon dioxide. Well, the plants are going to use that carbon dioxide, and we produce that right now when we split that pyruvate into carbon dioxide. The other thing that we're going to create is a molecule called NADH. And NADH is the important molecule that I want you to remember, because the NADH is going to go to the electron transport chain. And I'm not going to get too in detail here, because if you are confused about what happens in the electron transport chain, then you need to look that up on YouTube somewhere else by yourself. But essentially, what happens is we take all the H's off of all those NADH molecules, and we funnel them between the inner and the outer membrane space. They call that the intermembrane space. And when you have a whole bunch of hydrogens in one area, they want to get back out. So they're going to flow down the only place they can leave, which is a place called ATP synthase, which is going to turn. Every time a hydrogen flows through that, it's going to turn that little turbine, and in the end, one molecule of glucose is going to create 34 ATP, which is way more than glycolysis and Krebs put together. So the electron transport chain by far makes the most energy, and so that is why aerobic respiration creates more energy, because aerobic respiration allows that oxygen to shuttle that pyruvate into the mitochondria. And then we get to the electron transport chain, we take those hydrogens off of the NADH, shuttle them down, and turns that into 34 ATP. So if you have any questions, obviously, look at other YouTube videos. This test wants you guys to be prepared. And I hope this helped. See you later.